Welcome, everyone, to the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord. We're a group of like-minded people using John Vervaeke's work to cultivate wisdom, meaning, and communitas. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe because it really helps us with the algorithm. And if you're new to us, you'll find a link in the Discord in the notes. If you want to ask your own questions, you'll have to join the Discord to do so. My name is Brett, and now I'm pleased to welcome John Vervaeke here once again to answer your questions. Hey, John, how are you doing?
Good, Brett. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, it's always such a pleasure. Now, you've just been to a consciousness conference. Can you tell us a little bit
Yep.
about that?
I've been to the Consciousness and Conscience conference, and then that was in Thunder Bay, and then last weekend I was in Prague for the Democracy in the 21st Century conference. But I particularly wanted to bring up the Consciousness and Conscience conference because I was there with Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Pajot, as well as a lot of people from this corner of the internet. Sevilla King was there, Christopher Master Pietro was there. And it was really powerful. I think Jonathan gave his best talk that I've ever heard him give. There was some. I think my talk on consciousness was. I'm getting feedback. It's sort of the clearest presentation about the particular model I have. The interactions between Paul and myself, and Jonathan and myself, were also really, really powerful. It was just an amazing, and I got to lead. Also in a practice, I taught them basic centering, and then also took them through the Neoplatonic contemplative practice, and so it was all around just a really, really powerful conference. There was a lot of sense, sort of in this corner of the internet, of momentum, and things are entering into a different phase that a lot of people were articulating at the conference. So I just wanted to share that with everyone.
Yeah, thanks for that. And for those who are wanting to follow up on this conference, are all the talks available online for people?
Yes, they are releasing them all. Um, uh, Catherine Wilson, who organized the conference, is releasing them on a specific channel for the Consciousness and Conscience conference. But Paul and I think Jonathan, Paul in particular, is also releasing the talks on his channel. So there's lots of places where you can find them.
All right, great. And we'll try to post some of the links to that in the show notes as well. So
Great.
Marco asks, how to deal with the fear of shifting the attention from the thoughts to the breath body, as if losing some sort of safety in doing so. Is this the unfamiliar conducive to freedom that you mentioned?
Yeah, it is, and that's a challenge, and and this is why I'm having some background in the non-propositional knowings and the fact that they're there, and we can sink into them as we decouple and de-identify from the speaking mind. That can be a very helpful bridge to give people a more sense of having a place where they land as they disconnect propositional. Now, of course, eventually, as you get deeper into mindfulness traditions, Vipassana, Zen, you want to even challenge the safety net of the non-propositional knowing. But by that time, you've gone through some of the shock of disidentification. It doesn't make it easier, but it often makes it less sort of traumatizing.
LLK asks, what is the relation between emanation and emergence, and the one and the many? Is the movement from the one to the many emanation, and from the many to the one emergence? And if you could just give a general definition of emanation and emergence as well.
Yes, emanation, but the question was exactly right. Emanation is the movement from the one to the many. It's top down. It's the giving of form in the Platonic sense. And emergence is bottom up from the many to the one. And it's about integrating things so that they can be more intelligible and ultimately more real. And the idea is you're moving from something like the principle of principles at the top to raw process at the bottom. Something like what we see in quantum mechanics at the very bottom, and then at the top, the levels above have top-down constraint effects. I recommend a talk that I did with Wolfgang Schmidt on Karen Wong's The Meaning Code. We found very deep convergence for he's a mathematician and physicist, very deep convergence between his notion of vertical causation and the kind of model I'm proposing here. They're both deeply influenced and inspired by Neoplatonism.
Clog asked, what is or are your greatest disagreements with Nishitani? And what did he get wrong about Western philosophy and medieval philosophy?
Yeah, my biggest disagreements with Nishitani are around his understanding, or I would argue his misunderstanding of Neoplatonism. But to be fair to him, that criticism is anachronistic. He was dealing with sort of the scholarship before third wave Platonism, the third way of the advent with Gonzalez and Hyland and Kirkland and Ruchik and all those people. And this will become clearer, by the way, to people when I do After Socrates, when it gets released, which is very soon, by the way, the first episodes. So he was criticizing a more academic model of Platonism and also, therefore, of Neoplatonism. I think E.T. Suzuki should have been more of an influence on him, because Suzuki, especially in Christian and Buddhist mysticism, sees a lot more deep similarities between Neoplatonism and aspects of Zen, especially Christian Neoplatonism. That's also part of the problem. I think I don't see Nishitani doing enough to understand the innovations that are brought about with Christian Neoplatonism. All of that being said, one more thing in Nishitani's defense. Not only is the criticism anachronistic to some degree, I mean, Nishitani was studying under Heidegger, and many people, Drew Heinlein, are particularly good at pointing this out. Heidegger is so careful, and he tries to make use of the whole context and do the etymology and build things out so much when he does the pre-Socratics, and yet when he comes to Plato, he just takes out the arguments outside of the dramatic context, outside of the historical context, and just comes up with this very, very simplistic, I would argue, interpretation of Plato. Now, I think Ralkowski makes a good argument that Heidegger originally had a very deep appreciation and reading of Plato, and then he sort of does this flip on Plato and makes Plato sort of the villain of the history of Western nihilism, under the influence of Nietzsche, who also, I think, misreads Plato in a profound way. And so the influence of Heidegger and Nietzsche on Nishitani, I think, was also deleterious to his ability to properly interpret Neoplatonism.
Julian asks, are you able to summarize your Religion That's Not a Religion project? I'm currently looking at Peterson's work on the Bible, and now understand a bit better the use of religion in some way. Is your work trying to integrate such manner in a more rational and speakable way?
Yeah, I want to both at the level of the ecology of practices, the meta level of dialectic into dialogos, and then the community homing. I want to understand the functionality of religion for the cultivation of ratio religio, right connectedness, and the cultivation of wisdom and that kind of meaning in life, in a way that doesn't require me giving my allegiance to the two worlds mythology and metaphysical picture of the axial revolution that is sewn into the legacy religions, some more than others. And so, if you mean by rational in the Socratic sense and not in the modern Cartesian computational sense, yes, I want a rational appreciation, meaning both understanding and gratitude and appreciation, recognizing the value of. I want a rational appreciation of the functionality of religion in all those dimensions, such that we can plausibly recreate, if not improve upon that functionality for addressing the meaning crisis without buying into the historical development of the legacy religions that has contributed to the meaning crisis.
Fanny asks, is the world eternal, or did time have a beginning, if that's even a coherent question?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to ask that. If I have the relevant expertise. I mean, I I tend to think of emanation and emergence, meaning also the deep interpenetration of eternity and time, and that a lot of um, spirituality, for lack of a better term, and we really have to come up with a better term, but a lot of spirituality is about negotiating that interpenetration. You see it, of course, in Plato. You see it also in Kierkegaard, where he's really trying to wrestle between eternity and temporality in important ways. I don't know if the world is everlasting. That's a horizontal question. Does it extend forever in time? I do know, sorry, I do think there is good reason and evidence to believe that there is an eternal aspect to reality. But we shouldn't confuse eternity, which is a vertical dimension of aspects of the world that are not temporally or spatially given, with the horizontal dimension of everlastingness. They're not the same thing. The Greeks, in fact, hang on a second, I need to take a drink. The Greeks, in fact, discovered the difference between it. They realized that their gods were everlasting, immortal, but the gods were not eternal. Gods did not reflect the ultimate ground of being. And this is part of what drove Plato's project, because of the inadequacy of the gods, because immortality is not the same thing as eternity. So I don't know if the world is everlasting. I'm not qualified to even answer that question. Or what I can say is I do not think we should confuse everlasting with eternal. And I think there is good reason to believe, convergent with a lot of other people, a lot of conversations I've been having, that there is an eternal dimension to reality.
Mark 1969 asks, what do you think of the ancient Aristotelian notion of being as substance and accident? What is deeply right about it, and what is deeply wrong, if anything?
So the problem with the substance notion, I think the notion of being, what I find problematic in Aristotle is the equation of being with actuality. I think this doesn't take into account the reality of possibility. This is part of the problem that Aristotle has when he's trying to understand agency, I would argue. I think what's problematic about the notion of substance is it's a metaphysical proposal. Other people have stated this. This is not original to me by any means. It's a metaphysical proposal that is governed largely by the grammar of our language and our propositional thinking. And many people have pointed, if you shift out of those, this of course is one of the claims of Taoism, certain versions of Buddhism and Vedanta. If you shift out of those, then the idea of ultimate reality being a substance in the Aristotelian sense of that which is the bearer of predicates but is not itself a predicate, fails to capture these non-propositional aspects of reality that may be more fundamental to it. An Aristotelian, especially a Thomistic Aristotelian, although I hesitate to say that now because I'm convinced by quite a few people that Thomas was better understood as a Neoplatonist rather than an Aristotelian. I'm talking about Thomas Aquinas. But I can see maybe a scholastic, maybe that's the term I'm looking for, arguing that the notion of substance is ultimately not part of the grammar of our language or our thought or derived from that, but reflects something fundamental about reality. I find that questionable. And it's very hard, for example, to square a substance metaphysics with non-duality, which is found, in the Neoplatonic tradition, not just in the Eastern traditions. And of course, famously, Plato, but even more so, more explicitly, in a more developed manner, Plotinus argued that the one is beyond being and is not a substance. Um, so those are some of the problems I have with the Aristotelian framework. What it got right is an attempt to get very clear about the possible conformity between the structures of intelligibility and the structures of reality. I just think that Aristotle, with his syllogistic logic, gets that intelligibility incorrect, and then that leads into his model of being and substance and accident. But I think his attempt to clarify how there's a deep conformity between the structures of intelligibility and the structures of reality, I think that's I think that's something he got profoundly right. Now, he takes it over from Plato, but he also tries to develop it and advance it. And even if he's mistaken, these are glorious mistakes. I wish I made mistakes like Aristotle has made. So that's my best answer to that question.
That's great. Kubash asks, how would you link the 4 P's of knowing to the transcendentals, truth, good, and beauty? And a possible follow-up.
Sorry, Brett, you broke up.
Sorry. How would you link...
Oh.
Am I better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can you do that? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. How would you link the 4 P's of knowing to the transcendentals, truth, good, and beauty? And a possible follow-up. Right. Could you describe how each P manifests at different levels of organization? Example, bacteria to mammals to humans. And if you could just give a very brief summary of the 4 P's of knowing for people.
Okay, so the 4 P's of knowing is the propositional, which is knowing that, which leads to beliefs that we are convinced are true or false, stored in semantic memory. Procedural knowing is knowing how, which leads to skills that apply well or not, aptly or not, and it leads to a sense of empowerment. It's stored as well procedural memory. Perspectival knowing is knowing what it's like to be within, to be the center of a particular perspective, salience, landscaping, what it's like to be you here now in this state of mind, in this situation, and how the two fit together. And it carries with it a sense of presence. It's stored as episodic memory. And then participatory knowing is the kind of knowing that is given to how you and the environment have been co-shaped by physics and by biology and by culture and by your ongoing online cognition, so that you fit to each other such that affordances for action and for thought are generated. And this brings with it a sense of belonging and a kind of realness. And it's carried in a very interesting kind of memory structure you call the self, or you call yourself. So those are the 3 kinds of knowing. Each one in that order I gave, like the procedural is the space in which you transform the propositional, perspectival is the space in which you transform the procedural, and the participatory is the space in which you transform the perspectival. So is that good enough, Brett?
Yeah, that's fantastic. And he asks, so how do the 4 P's of knowing relate to the transcendentals of truth, good, and beauty?
Yes. So I think the transcendentals are aspects of the good or the one, in that they all interpenetrate each other, and that the goodness in truth, good, and beauty is not the same thing as the good, which the good is that promise that Aristotle was trying to explicate, that the development of intelligibility will always find its corresponding disclosure in reality, so that the wedding of intelligibility and realness never pull apart. And even though you can't give any argument for that, because all arguments presuppose that deep conformity. between intelligibility and realness. But we seem to find that the inexhaustibleness of reality never generates a break from intelligibility. And of course, this is the fundamental presupposition of the scientific worldview itself, as Nicholas Maxwell makes repeatedly clear in his work, that science presupposes the intelligibility of the world. Now, I think that the transcendentals are, especially how they're interpenetrated, they point to fundamental aspects of reality. And so I do not think, for example, that the true is just the true of propositions, or the good is just the good of ethical rules, or the beautiful is just aesthetic beauty. I think the beautiful has to do with the relationship between appearance and reality, which is fundamental to the relationship between intelligibility and realness. I think goodness has ultimately to do with the capacity for the intelligibility and the realness to conform to each other, such that things like life and mind are actualities and not just logical possibilities. And I think the true is, it's not just the truth of our propositions, but it's the kind of true we talk about when we're being true to somebody, or our aim is true. There's a procedural sense in our aim is true. There's a perspectival sense in being true to someone, and even a deep participatory sense. You're binding your identity to theirs. So what I'm trying to say is, I think you have to, as we moved down the stack from the propositional to the procedural to the perspectival to the participatory, we get a more and more primordial knowing of the three transcendentals. And this, of course, is part of what has been argued in a lot of third way Platonism, that it's the non-propositional that is being emphasized by Plato, and of course, as I said, by the Neoplatonic tradition. And so the depths that we can get to as we move through the stack and get them to interrelate to each other allows us to plumb the depths of the transcendentals in something like perspectival and participatory knowing. But if we've cultivated the understanding dimension of wisdom, we can translate that to skills and possibly also to beliefs. And of course, that's the notion of virtue. The virtue is an integration of belief, skill, states of mind, and traits of character, all four levels, that puts us in a ratio religio, a right relationship with ourselves, with other people, and the world. So I don't think it's the case that like each kind of knowing maps onto a transcendental. I think the transcendentals disclose themselves in an increasingly profound way as we move into the depths of non-propositional knowing. But part of our project, of course, is to what degree can we translate that back into states of consciousness, skills, and propositional theories. And of course, that's exactly what you see happening in many philosophical traditions. The Neoplatonic easily comes to mind. Different levels of reality in correspondence with that argument give different priorities. So, for example, I think there's the life of a paramecium, but I do recommend taking a look at both of the discussions I've had with Michael Levin on Karen's meaning code. The meaning code is on fire right now. Everyone pay attention to it. That channel is going to take off. But anyways, I think a paramecium is almost completely participatory knowing, perhaps a little bit of perspectival in the sense that it has a minimal aspectualization of its environment. It relates to the sucrose molecule as food and other molecules as poison, but I'm very hesitant to attribute any kind of consciousness to it. It doesn't have anything like skills, because it doesn't have anything like learning. And of course, it's not doing anything propositional. And then as you move up the phylogenetic scale, you don't lose the importance of the participatory, but the other ones start to grow, the perspectival and the procedural and the propositional. I hope that answers the question, Brett.
Thanks, John. Benjamin Sadiq asks, the desire to connect meaning with reality seems to be a primary motivator for some, but for others it seems to be a desire to connect possibility with beneficiality. Have you seen a similar pattern that differentiates people?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question correctly, I think the utopian ideal, which Johanna calls the Promethean ideal, the ideal that the ideal that we have the capacity to perfect ourselves and perfect the world such that we're living in as perfect people in a perfect world. And that, of course, is what the utopian proposal is. I think that does point towards the latter of the two. And people who orient that way definitely prioritize the benefits of possibility over connecting meaning to reality. Nostalgia is the same way. Utopia and nostalgia are mirror images of each other. Just the sort of temporal arrow is just in different directions. So the nostalgia is there was some Edenic place in which we were perfect people living in a perfect world, and then we have fallen away from that, and we need to return to it. As many of you know, I definitely think this is a stance, an orientation that people take up. I think it's I'm almost completely critical of these two, neither nostalgia nor utopia, because they do this prioritization at the expense of meaning connecting to reality. And what that very quickly does is gives an ends justifies the means stance towards the world. And of course, this is the point of people like Johanna and Glenn Dennings and others writing about the intellectual and philosophical history of the West or Europe. That is what allows these stances to be so strongly associated with totalitarian regimes that are bloodthirsty. And we of course have seen the utopian, and we're seeing, I hope, the fall of a nostalgic thug theocracy in Iran right now. So I'm very critical of them for that reason. And so I think part of, yeah, this is really pretentious and bold, but part of the task I see myself with the work of and help of many others is to wean people off the hunger for nostalgia and utopia, because they have been too predictive and causal of a lot of human suffering. Whereas the project of the cultivation of wisdom, as distinct from the project of utopia, project of trying to connect, meaning more and more ratio religio to reality, that has not had the same deleterious history. That's my best answer.
Clark asks, is the devil death itself? This is how the devil has most often been represented. And you talk of evil as self-destruction. Is death not self-destruction?
I mean, it doesn't have to be, of course. I mean, death at the hands of others is not self-destruction. I think we should also not confuse. I mean, this is a point that both the Epicureans and the Stoics were very careful about, and perhaps we can learn from their example. We should be very careful about the distinction between death and dying. Death is not being, and that therefore it is not anything. It is not self-destruction. It is not destructiveness. Dying could be, I suppose, if you die of cancer, that's biological self-destructiveness. Or you die of old age, that's metabolic self-destructiveness. I don't think those are evil. And I don't think that not being, which is what death is evil. In fact, you don't care about the not being that pre-existed you. There have been millennia where there was no John Vervaeke, and that doesn't terrify me. And I can't possibly experience the future in which I won't exist. So I think I've learned under the tutorage of the Epicureans and the Stoics that doesn't scare me. Dying is a different thing. Dying is something you can experience, and old age and your mortality is something you can experience, insofar as your mortality is your ongoing vulnerability to a reality of which you are not the center. Is that evil? So I'm really enjoying this question. It's really making me think. Because I think it's the case that Whitehead is right, that evil is inherently self-destructive, but the other is not the case, that there's certain kinds of self-destruction that are not driven by our cognitive agency. Those are not evil, like the way my metabolism, in some sense, self-destructs. I don't think that's evil. I don't think it's appropriate to say that cancer even is evil. I think we should reserve evil for cognitive agents that are self-destructive in a way that is also has an ongoing power to be destructive of others. That's what I would say evil is. So I don't think death, the state of death, or the non-state of death, to speak very carefully and accurately, is evil. It's nothing, and therefore it has no properties, and we shouldn't fear it. Dying, insofar as dying is due to non-cognitive self-destructiveness, I don't see it as properly being understood as evil. I think evil is understood as cognitive, either individual cognition or especially, and this is the discussions with Jonathan, the level of the collective intelligence of distributed cognition being self-destructive, and therefore undermining meaning and culture and the possibility of civilization. I think that's the kind of self-destructiveness that's evil. So not all self-destructiveness is evil, even though all evil is self-destructive. That's how I would answer that question.
Capello asks, how would you describe the Neoplatonic account of intelligibility? It seems rational, but is it purposive? It makes the good possible, but is there moral agency behind that affordance? If it's impersonal, how do we speak of reason and goodness outside of the mind? What is the most coherent way that these elements come together for you?
Yes. So it's to reverse the question. We have to be very careful about terms like rational. When we say the structure of the universe is rational, we don't mean the same thing as the act of being rational. We mean that our rationality discloses it better than any other faculty we have. It's very much like, we can use calculus to describe the behavior of the solar system, and in that sense, the behavior of the solar system is mathematical. But that doesn't mean the solar system is doing calculus or doing math. Now, the Neoplatonic notion of intelligibility that is impersonal is exactly for that reason. It's trying to straddle the boundary of the division that we tend to throw up in the Cartesian framework between those two different senses of math, the doing of math and the fact that math seems to be a good way of disclosing reality, and what Neoplatonism is proposing, that there must be a common source for those two that binds them together. This was one of Einstein's great questions. It's like, why does math, and Kant had the same question, why does math describe the world so well? Why is it so good at making the invisible visible? Why is it so good at allowing us to talk about things so displaced in time and space? One answer is Kant's answer, which is the answer that the mind imposes all of that on the world, and the world is not actually mathematically organized in the impersonal sense. And then, of course, you have all kinds of problems with that. The other answer is to say, well, that the principles that are at work when you're doing math or when you're reasoning, and the principles that are at work when the solar system is spinning mathematically, or we understand the universe through rational framework. The proposal there is no, the principles without and within are actually siblings of a deeper parent, a deeper common shared principle that actually explains how and why they're bound together. We are actually siblings of a common parent, the one. And so the oneing of the world and the oneing of our mind when we understand the world are conformable to each other, not because they're logically identical, because they're not, but precisely because they are they participate in a continuity with each other because they are siblings of a common origin. And I think that is a much better answer, and it's actually a much better explanation of why science and math work, and why they keep working, and that converge with a lot of other arguments for a Neoplatonic framework. But I would then say that we're in this position where the one is neither impersonal, objective, nor personal, subjective. That the closest we have of understanding the nature of the one is in our transjective relations. And that's exactly what intelligibility is itself. Intelligibility is co-created by the structures of the mind and the structures of the world. The ability of your mind and the world to co-pattern with each other. The ability of your mind and the world to co-process with each other, etc. So, I think, in fact, the Neoplatonic framework has an advantage over the frameworks that try to reduce it to either, well, there must be a reasoning agent out there, or a sort of the opposite, we are the only reasoning agents. There must not be anything rational in the impersonal sense in the world like Kant does. And I think the Neoplatonic position is actually recommended precisely because it steers between that Scylla and Charybdis. It steers between a Kantian kind of radical disconnection from the way reality is, or the requirement to attribute a rational agency to the ordering of the world. That's my best answer to that.
Marta would like to know, is the being mode different from a desire to have a certain kind of being?
Yeah, yes. And I recommend Slingerland's book, Trying Not to Try. If you try to have the being mode, you will precisely not have it. Sorry, I misspoke. If you try to have the being mode, you will precisely not experience it because you're trying to have it. And so it's very interesting about all the strategies that are used when people are within the having mode who want to get into the being mode without leaving the framing of the having mode behind. And so, of course, Jesus of Nazareth is a master at this, the use of a parable in which you want to have a story, but then it blows you out of that mode and you get into the kingdom of God. Very similar to the Sufi stories that do the same thing. Yeah, I think the answer is the being mode is different from wanting to have a particular experience or even have the being mode. And that is very problematic. And that's why you have all of these traditions who are into, well, as Slingerland, I think Slingerland's title is perfect, Trying Not to Try. The famous Zen thing. You will never achieve enlightenment by seeking, but only those who seek will achieve enlightenment. Those kinds of paradoxical self-undermining moves are designed exactly to try and answer that question by blowing apart the attempt to get at the being mode from within the having mode.
Can you think of maybe a short checklist of questions you could ask yourself to verify if you're in the being mode or just desiring to have the being mode? Is there anything you can ask yourself to help identify when you're in one or the other?
Yeah. So, how much are you generating answers as to, in comparison to how much are you experiencing wonder? How much are you sort of building a structure with how much are you in the flow state? How much is the goal what you're ultimately pursuing versus how much is the goal helping you to engage in the process, which is what you intrinsically value? Those would be some of the questions you would ask.
That's great. Birdman asks, I just got back from the Meta-Modern Spirituality Retreat in Vermont. I was really hoping that you might be there, but it was a great experience nonetheless. The theme of the retreat was goodness. How do you conceptualize goodness? Also, there was a discussion of certain values being present since the beginning of the universe, and thus intrinsic to the universe, such as uniqueness, because it might be said that the universe values uniqueness. The other side of the discussion was more pointing to values emerging once life emerges. What are your thoughts on the existence of value before the emergence of life?
So I believe that was led by Layman Pascal, I think, and so I wish I could have been there. Yeah, I think very highly of Layman. Layman and I were together in Vermont at the Respond retreat, and we've done lots of videos together. I think value is a Cartesian term, and it replaced virtue, and it talks about the degree to which we want, desire, or prefer something. And I think, therefore, talking about values independent of living things makes no sense to me. I think if we turn away from the term value and talk about things like the transcendentals and understand them not as values, but as ways in which reality is inherently good in the ontological sense, and we shouldn't be thinking of them as values. And if that's what one group of people were trying to point at with talking about values in the universe before there was life, I think what they're trying to say is that it makes sense to talk about truth and goodness, at least ontological goodness, and beauty, not as the experience of beauty, but as the real relationship between appearances and reality. You may say, well, what would appearances be if there are nothing to which they appear? And that has to do with whether or not you think that these notions of levels of reality are in fact real. Because if they are, then you can talk about something analogous to appearance in the relationship between the levels. It gets very, very tricky because the language we use is so anthropocentric and so cognitive, and we struggle to come up with terms that describe it. But D.C. Schindler makes this argument about we depend on a way in which reality is for itself, for its own sake, in order to determine the realness of things. That if something is completely relative to us, that's actually the definition of it not being anything but subjective. And the degree to which we can realize something as real depends on how reality has an important way in which it's for itself and for its own sake. But you have to hear that in a non-cognitive way. You have to experience it as the way in which at the core of yourself, you are for yourself. And it's not a preference or a value, it's a fundamental way in which you are, because you're an autopoietic being. And part of what I would argue is that for itself, for yourself, that can, because you're autopoietic, that can actually make you a self, ultimately depends on, is grounded in that reality is realizing itself for itself. Like Neoplatonicism says, the real self-realization of reality. I would just amend that by saying, putting some DC Schindler on it, the real self-realization of reality for its own sake. And in that sense, this sort of deepest thing about us that everything is centered upon because we're autopoietic, a kind of ontological good that is presupposed by any of our values or our preferences or our desires. I think it's at one, not identical to, but at one with an aspect of reality that Schindler is putting his finger on and that Plato is talking about, and that's the through line, it's the for itselfness of everything. I think we can therefore properly talk about the transcendentals without there being living things. So values, only when there's living things. The transcendentals, even if there aren't. That being said, I think it's clear that I would prefer a universe with life in it over one without life. And I would prefer a universe with sentient life over a universe without sentient life. And I would prefer a universe with intelligent, conscious, sentient life over a universe with just sentient life, etc. Because these levels of being disclose the depths of being. Until there is life in a universe, there's certain principles, organizational principles of reality that are not disclosed. They're only disclosed when there's life, and and further ones are only disclosed when there is conscious life and rationally reflective life. So although there may not be many of us, quantitatively we're insignificant, I think qualitatively we are very important because we reveal a capacity of the universe that goes to the guts of its organizing principles that it would otherwise not be disclosed. So I think, given those three ways of talking, no value without life, I think the transcendentals without life. But nevertheless, the transcendentals are most deeply disclosed or revealed when there is conscious, rationally reflective, sentient life. That would be my answer.
Thanks. I'm just going to skip ahead a few. We haven't had anybody reading their own question, and Garrett is here, so I wanted to make sure he got in. Garrett, you have a question for John.
Yeah. Hi, John. I hope you're doing well.
I am. Thank you. I'm spread a little thin and a little tired from all the retreats and conferences, but still doing well. Thank you for asking. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. So I'm trying to help make your arguments a little more available, and I think your ownership and eloquence will aid me here. I have two interrelated questions designed to present your argument to a wider or more general audience. But some of what you've already talked about in previous questions will touch on this, but I sort of want you to treat this as if new people are hearing it.
Okay, fair enough.
And I apologize in advance for the sharpness of the tone of these questions. I'm trying to predict and emulate those who are the most skeptical of you and the usefulness of your work to help further the reach of your argument.
I appreciate that. I've been trying to talk to people who are more skeptical of my work and even record some videos about that. Yeah.
Here are the questions. In the face of the notion that meaning is subjective and therefore arbitrary, You argue that it is neither subjective nor objective, but some third thing called transjective.
Yes.
This quote-unquote way out is arguably at the center of many people's interest in your work.
Yes.
The first question, it's a question from the skeptics. What is transjectivity, and how is it not simply a smuggling in of some implicit objectivity? And what especially does it say about ethics? They're really wondering, what ethics are you smuggling in? And the second is a question from the more typical moral realists. How does this transjectivity not fizzle out into nothing? What is real in it? What does it give people? Really wondering, will this actually guide anybody, especially whole cultures, towards the good? What does it do to normativity?
Sure.
And I think those questions are related to how goal states affect interpretation. Like, the skeptics want to know what your goal state is, your secret agenda. The developing open-endedness of it sounds to the usual moral realists like vagueness, and they wonder whether it really is a goal state, whether it really is guiding and helpful. They don't understand this connectedness thing, and they don't know how to measure it, and thereby increase it or argue for it normatively. They want something more than, well, you can just feel connectedness and disconnectedness. So,
yeah.
Is that fair?
Sorry, are you done, Garrett?
Yeah, that's it. No, that's it.
So the first part, so I would ask the skeptic, if there is this radical, uncrossable divide between subjectivity and objectivity, how is knowledge even possible? They smuggle in fact, a bridge between them, which they call truth. And if I was to ask them, is truth a subjective phenomena? They would tell me no. And if I was to ask them, is truth an objective? And I'll use their standards. Can you tell me how it's physically measurable, a truth? They don't have an answer. So this is Heidegger's point. They actually smuggle in the transjectivity in order to overcome skepticism, in order to pursue any kind of knowledge claim. And this is his argument about aletheia truth, is presupposed by any correspondence model of truth, any representational model of truth. This cashes up also into perception. This is Gibson's work, that we don't perceive, perception is neither subjective nor objective. Perception is about affordances, and affordances are neither given by me nor by the world, but how we fit together. I would ask the person who is so skeptical of this, how we are to understand the adaptivity of an organism. Is it given by the internal life of the organism, which I take to be the basis of subjectivity? Of course not. Is it given by the objective environment? Of course not. The adaptivity of the great white shark is a real relation. The problem underneath this is a presupposition that nominalism must be true, and that there are no real relations, that all that really exists are ultimately individual things. And I put it to you that there's no good argument for nominalism. It was just a historical turn, and there are many good arguments against nominalism. So I find the criticisms actually often verging on the edge of being performative contradictions, because, like I said, they presuppose truth. And tell me what it is to presuppose truth, which is the binding between between subjectivity and objectivity, if there's no meaning. Truth is dependent on meaning. Even semantic truth is dependent on semantic meaning. If I say to you, giggle frips, frequently bing bong, you can't tell me if that's true or false because you don't know what the hell it means. And yet again, do you seriously mean that meaning is only within you and that it's imposed on the world? And that means that what you're referring to and the truth of those meaningful statements is also purely subjective? What are you going to do with science if that's your view? Now, about the ethics and the normativity.
So, sorry, John, could I just interject? He had asked you to define transjective. Could you do that as well?
Well, first of all, the transjective is to say that there is a reality that is neither generated by the subject nor generated by the objective understanding of the world or the objective reality of the world. Then instead, the transjective is that which properly relates them together such that meaning, truth, and knowledge are possible. And I tried to give examples in terms of affordance or adaptivity as how that matters even to organisms that don't have language. And is that good enough, Brett?
Yes, thank you.
The normativity issue is, well, first of all, I'm wondering, I mean, there's the hermeneutics of suspicion in the one question that I have a secret agenda, and that the way we get at the truth is to get behind the way in which I'm distorting and misrepresenting my actual intent or goal. First of all, that's unfair to me. Secondly, and more importantly, the hermeneutics of suspicion is parasitic on the hermeneutics of beauty, and I've made this argument before. This is Merleau-Ponty, but it goes back to Plato. Saying something is real is a comparative. Real is a comparative term. You can only say that something's an illusion by pointing to something else that is real. You can't have a standalone hermeneutics of suspicion. Contra Descartes, contra certain versions of postmodernism. So part of my agenda is to get people to realize that they should give up prioritizing the hermeneutics of suspicion, and in fact realize that most of the time the appearances have to be capable of disclosing reality. We couldn't actually do science. We couldn't actually move around in the world to the degree of success we do. We couldn't solve our problems. And by the way, where does a problem exist? Is it just subjective? Really? Because it seems like you have to change conditions in the world in order for there to be a solution to your problem. Is it just objective? So would there be problems if there weren't living beings? Of course not. The universe is not unfolding teleologically. There are no problems in the world. Problems are a misfittedness, a lack of proper relationship between the organism and the world. And do you want to tell me that because problems are transjective, they don't exist? That is also a performative contradiction, because you're problematizing something while at the same time claiming it doesn't have an underlying reality. So, I mean, I could go on, Garrett, because in many ways, this is the fundamental thing I'm trying to, I guess it's fair to say, argue against. But is that enough of a beginning of an answer for you?
Sure, right. This is, yeah, thank you. I do appreciate that.
And I'm wondering what it is, other than I don't agree with their worldview, that gives them cause to say, I have a secret agenda or ulterior motives. I mean,
Right.
I'm a fallible human being. I mean, I'm a fallible human being, and of course, I'm capable of vice like anybody else. But they're making a specific claim about me in a specific manner, and I'm wondering where that's coming from.
Right. Well, part of this is inspired from day-to-day interactions and the variance in which people hold these positions in the culture, less so in an academic sense as well.
I see. Yeah.
It's hard for me to put my finger on that, but that does tend to...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm putting you on the spot, and I don't mean to. I was just trying to enter into a real discussion with you.
Sure.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
You're fine.
Okay.
Sure. Well, those do tend to be both the positions that I bump up against and have a hard time bridging this divide with the transjective, is those people who make very firm claims about moral reality and people who want absolutely nothing to do with anything besides a relativism. They don't put it in those words. Like I said, I'm more addressing people's day-to-day
Right.
interactions.
Yeah, I get that. I get that.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you for
that's
answering me, Garrett.
very good start for. I'm gonna have to soak that in the recording. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for asking that. And I need to get going.
Sure.
Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, just having to soak it in is my reaction to all of these Q&As. There's just so much in there. So thank you once again for being here, John. And thank you again to all the people asking questions. We really appreciate it. The questions are just fantastic. And
Yeah, questions were amazing. They're really, really good. Really good.
so thanks to everyone.
Oh, I wanted to mention one final benefit. I forgot about the Consciousness and Conscience Conference. I got to meet Mark in person, which was a
Fantastic.
genuine pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Take good care.
Take care. Have a great night.